What would you do if a small act of kindness, something so simple, so ordinary, ended up changing someone's entire life? What if just a few words, scribbled in crayon by a little girl, became a treasure carried for decades? This isn't just a story about a bus driver and his passengers. It's about how one small thank you can outlive the very people who give it. Before we begin, take a moment. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop it down in the comments. I'd love to know how far this story is traveling. Because stories like this, they don't just belong to one town or one family. They belong to all of us. And as you listen, maybe you'll think back to a time when a kind word carried you through a hard day. Or maybe you'll be reminded of someone you never got the chance to thank. This is the story of a man who drove a bus every day, believing his work was ordinary, and a little girl who, without even realizing it, proved him wrong. What she gave him wasn't money. It wasn't a gift you could hold in your hands. It was something far greater, something he carried with him, folded neatly until the very end of his life. So lean in, settle into the quiet for a moment, because what you're about to hear might just make you think twice about the power of your own words. When the old man passed away, his family gathered in the modest little house where he'd spent most of his life. It wasn't a grand place. The paint on the porch had begun to peel, the floorboards creaked underfoot, and the air carried the faint smell of coffee that seemed to linger in the walls. But it was home, and it held the quiet story of a man who had lived without much fuss or fanfare. They moved carefully through his belongings, touching each object as if it still carried a piece of him. Folded shirts, neatly stacked in drawers. A pair of worn work boots, tucked by the door as though waiting for him to slip them on again. A stack of letters and bills, bundled with a rubber band that had lost its stretch. Each item told the story of a man who had lived simply, predictably, and without extravagance. And then they found his wallet. It was leather, though time had softened it until it no longer looked new, but rather like something that had lived a life of its own. The corners were frayed, the stitching slightly loose, the surface cracked in places from being pulled in and out of a pocket thousands of times. To anyone else, it might have looked ordinary, just another old man's wallet. Inside, they expected to find the usual things: an ID card, perhaps a few worn-out photographs of family members, receipts from grocery trips long forgotten. And yes, those were there. But tucked behind a plastic window, hidden where few would notice, was something that made them stop. It wasn't money. It wasn't a driver's license. It wasn't even a photograph. It was a note, a small, fragile piece of paper, folded neatly but worn thin from years of being carried. The edges were soft and frayed, the once white surface now yellow with time. The creases ran deep, threatening to tear if handled carelessly. It looked as though it had been opened and closed hundreds, maybe thousands of times. They unfolded it slowly, and there, in the uneven handwriting of a child, were just a few words. Words so simple, they could have been overlooked. Thank you for being so kind. The room fell quiet. It wasn't elaborate. It wasn't eloquent. But in that moment, everyone understood it was precious. The old man had carried this piece of paper with him every single day, through mornings and nights, through hardships and joys, through the changing seasons of his life. And he had never let it go. Why? Why would a man hold on to something so small, so seemingly insignificant? What meaning could be hidden in those crooked letters written by a child's hand? No one in that room had the answer. Not yet. But the truth was this. Behind those few words lay a story of two lives that had quietly crossed, of a kindness so small it could have been forgotten, and yet it wasn't. This was their story. A story about a child who wanted to say thank you, and a man who carried those words for the rest of his life. He was not the kind of man people wrote stories about. His name didn't make the newspaper. His life was not filled with adventure or applause. To most who passed him by on the street, he was simply another face in the crowd, an ordinary man, quiet, unassuming, blending into the rhythm of small-town life. But to those children who climbed the steps of his bus each morning, he was something more. Every day began the same. Long before the sun rose, he stirred from his bed, the faint creak of the old mattress following him as he sat up. He brewed a simple cup of coffee, strong but plain, the steam curling in the dim kitchen light. He buttoned his jacket, always the same worn one, patched in places, but still reliable. And then he stepped out into the morning chill, breath visible in the crisp air as he made his way to the bus yard. The bus was waiting for him, heavy and still, its yellow paint dulled by years of weather. He would climb aboard, settling into the driver's seat as though it were an extension of himself. The engine rumbled awake beneath his hands, its familiar growl echoing against the quiet streets. And with that, his day began, not with fanfare, not with celebration, but with the steady promise that he would be there. Stop after stop, corner after corner, he picked up the children. Some were still sleepy, rubbing their eyes, clutching backpacks that seemed too big for their small shoulders. Others were loud, playful, filling the bus with laughter and chatter. He greeted each of them in his own way, sometimes with a nod, sometimes with a quiet smile, sometimes with a gentle word of encouragement. He wasn't the kind of man to demand silence or strict order. He understood children, understood their noise, their restlessness, their fears. And while he never raised his voice, his presence commanded respect, not through authority, but through kindness. There were small rituals that never changed. On cold mornings, he would remind them to zip their coats, his voice calm but caring. On rainy days, he would warn them not to slip on the wet steps. If someone dropped a lunch bag, he was the first to notice, leaning down to pick it up before the bus lurched forward. These gestures might have seemed insignificant to anyone else, but to the children, they meant something. They meant safety. They meant consistency. They meant that, no matter what the day ahead might bring, there was always one place in the world where they were cared for. And though he never thought of himself as important, he was quietly becoming a constant in their young lives. He was a steady hand on the wheel, the calm voice in the chaos, the familiar face they could always count on. He didn't know it then, but among the dozens of children who rode that bus day after day, there was one little girl who noticed his kindness more than most. One girl who carried his words, his small gestures, in her heart. And she was about to give him something he never expected, something that would follow him for the rest of his life. She was small for her age, the kind of child who could be overlooked in a crowded room, slipping quietly into background while louder voices and brighter personalities filled the space. At school, she walked with her head down, her books clutched tightly to her chest, as if they might shield her from the world around her. The teachers knew her name, but she was never the one who raised her hand first. She wasn't the one who rushed into games at recess, or who shouted across hallways to friends. She lived softly, quietly, as though she hoped the world might pass her by without asking too much of her. Home wasn't always easier. Her parents worked long hours, their lives weighed down by bills and responsibilities. Dinner at the kitchen table was often silent, interrupted only by the hum of the refrigerator or the scrape of forks on plates. Her parents loved her, yes, but love is not always loud. And so, she often felt as though she drifted through her days unseen, just another face in a world that moved too quickly. But every morning, something gave her comfort. It was the sound of the bus brakes, hissing as it pulled up to the corner. It was the sight of those wide yellow doors opening with a steady sigh. And it was a man behind the wheel, quiet, steady, always there. He didn't treat her like she was invisible. He didn't rush her, didn't overlook her the way others sometimes did. Instead, he offered her something small, something steady, a nod, a smile, a gentle word. On the days when her eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall, he didn't pry. He simply gave her that quiet acknowledgement that told her she was seen. When the mornings were cold and she shivered with her thin jacket pulled tight around her, he noticed. "Keep those hands warm," he would say, not in a commanding tone, but in a way that felt like someone caring. When the rain poured down, he made sure the door stayed open a few extra seconds so she could run without fear being left behind. To him, these were small things, barely worth remembering, but to her, they were everything. Because in a world where she often felt overlooked, his kindness stood out like a light in the dark. He didn't know her favorite color, or the stories she read at night, or the way she sometimes whispered to herself to feel less alone. But he gave her something far more important, proof that she mattered. And though she never found the courage to tell him in words, her heart swelled with gratitude. Gratitude too big for her small voice to carry. So she began to think of a way to say thank you, a way to give back, even just a little, to the man who had given her something she could not find anywhere else. One evening, she sat at her little desk by the window, the sky outside fading into dusk, and an idea began to take shape. She didn't have money. She didn't have anything grand, but she had paper. She had crayons, and she had words. And so she decided she would write him a note. The idea seemed simple at first. Just a note. Just a few words on a piece of paper. But for a little girl who rarely spoke up, who rarely raised her hand or asked to be noticed, this was not simple at all. She sat at her desk by the window, the soft glow of a lamp illuminating the worn wood. Her crayons were scattered across the surface, their wrappers peeled and torn, some broken in half from years of pressing too hard. A notebook lay open, the first few pages filled with doodles and half-started stories, the kind she never showed anyone. That night, though, she turned to a fresh page. She thought about what she wanted to say. How do you thank someone for something so small, yet so enormous? For a smile that made mornings feel less heavy. For a kindness that told her, without words, that she mattered. She didn't have grand sentences. She didn't know the right phrases adults used. She only knew how she felt. Her hand hovered above the paper, a stubby crayon gripped tightly between her fingers. She pressed down, slowly, carefully, each letter uneven but filled with intent. Thank you for driving me to school. The words looked plain, too plain, so she drew a small heart at the corner of the page. Then she added a sun in the top right, its rays stretching out unevenly, a little too big, but bright and cheerful. She colored it yellow, pressing the crayon so hard it nearly snapped. And then, in her wobbly handwriting, she added one more line. You make me feel safe. Her little heart raced as she read it back. The words were simple, childlike, but to her, they were everything she hadn't said aloud. She folded the note in half, then in half again, making it small enough to hide in her palm. She slipped it into her school bag, between the pages of a math book she rarely opened. For the rest of the evening, she couldn't stop thinking about it. At dinner, while her parents spoke in tired voices about bills, she touched the edge of the folded paper hidden in her pocket. When she brushed her teeth, she imagined the look on his face. When she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she wondered if he would even keep it, or if he would smile politely and tuck it away, forgotten. The next morning, the sky was heavy with gray clouds. The air smelled of rain, and the pavement glistened from an earlier shower. She walked to the bus stop with a note clutched in her pocket, her small fingers curling around it so tightly that it grew warm in her palm. Her chest thumped with nerves. Would he think it was silly? Would he laugh? Would he even understand what it meant? The bus arrived with familiar hiss, the wide yellow doors folding open. She stepped inside, her shoes squeaking faintly against the rubber floor. He greeted her, as he always did, with that small nod and gentle smile. And in that moment, she knew she couldn't wait any longer. Her hand trembled as she reached into her pocket. She pulled out the folded paper, walked up to him, her voice barely above a whisper. This is for you. She didn't wait for him to open it. She didn't wait for a reaction. She hurried down the aisle, cheeks flushed, and slid into her usual seat by the window. But inside, something shifted. She had done it. She had spoken, not with her voice, but with her heart. And as the bus rumbled forward, she watched the raindrops streak across the glass, her little hands pressed together in nervous anticipation, not knowing that those few simple words would carry far more weight than she could ever imagine. When he unfolded the little piece of paper, his rough hands trembled in a way he didn't expect. It wasn't the kind of trembling that came with age or weakness. It was a trembling that comes when something pierces through the armor a person wears every day without even realizing it. The handwriting was uneven, the letters slanting this way and that. A sun, drawn too big, stretched its rays across the corner. A small red heart was colored in with the kind of fierce pressure only a child could manage. And then those words. Thank you for driving me to school. You make me feel safe. He read them again, And again, he had heard, "Thank you," before in passing. Parents waved. Children mumbled it as they hurried off the bus. But this was different. These weren't words set out of habit. These were words chosen carefully. Words meant. Words that carried weight far beyond their simplicity. Something inside him broke open. He thought about how long he had been driving. Through winters when the roads turned to ice. Through mornings when the bus heater barely worked. Through days when no one noticed that he, too, woke before dawn to make sure children got to school safely. And now, here was this little girl who saw him, who understood him in a way most adults never did. He pressed the note flat against his knee, smoothing the creases with the edge of his thumb, as if preserving every line, every shaky letter. And without thinking, without hesitation, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his old leather wallet. It was worn and cracked at the edges, the kind of wallet that told a story just by the way it folded. Receipts were tucked in unevenly. A few faded photos peeked out from the plastic sleeves. But in the very center, behind the clear film where most people kept their driver's license or an ID card, he slipped the note inside. The paper looked fragile there, pressed between the folds of leather, but it fit perfectly, as though the wallet had been waiting for it all along. From that day forward, he carried it everywhere. Every morning when he got dressed, he checked for his wallet, patting his pocket as always. But now, it wasn't money or cards he thought about. It was that little folded piece of paper, that child's handwriting, that reminder that what he did mattered. Over the years, the edges grew soft. The ink faded just slightly, but he never let it leave his side. When life grew heavy, when he faced long nights, difficult news, or moments when the world seemed to pass him by, he would pull it out, slowly, carefully, and he would read it again. Each time, it was as though the girl's voice whispered across the years, "You make me feel safe." Those words anchored him. They steadied his hands when he was tired. They softened his heart when the world felt harsh. It was just a note, just a child's scrawl on lined paper. Yet to him, it became something sacred, a compass pointing him back to kindness, a reminder that his life, in its quiet routine, had touched another in a way that would never be forgotten. And so, the wallet became more than a place for money and cards. It became a keeper of meaning, of memory, of a bond that would stretch across decades. One folded note, carried close to his heart for the rest of his life. Time has a way of slipping by quietly. What begins as a single moment, as fragile as a paper note tucked inside a wallet, slowly stretches into years and then into decades. The bus driver's mornings continued much the same. He still rose before the sun, lacing up the same pair of sturdy boots by the kitchen table. He still brewed his coffee in that old metal pot, the one with a handle slightly bent from years of use. He still drove the familiar roads, greeting sleepy children with a gentle nod as they clambered onto the bus. But now, always, there was something different in the way he carried himself. For hidden in the pocket of his worn jeans, always pressed against his side, was the note. That little folded paper was not just a keepsake. It was a quiet fire that lit the routine of his days. Whenever a child stepped onto his bus, chattering about homework or clutching a backpack too big for their shoulders, he saw more than just another passenger. He saw someone's son or daughter, someone who needed patience, someone who needed to feel safe. And though he never said it aloud, the note reminded him this was his purpose. The years layered themselves one upon another, like the rings of a tree. His hair turned silver. The lines on his face deepened. His hands, once strong and quick, grew slower, but steadier somehow, as if each motion was measured with more care. Still, the note remained. Through summers when the heat pressed heavy against the bus windows, through winters when the glass frosted over and his breath hung in the air, through all of it, the note stayed, folded, carried, guarded. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between routes, he would take it out and read it again. The paper had grown soft, the edges worn thin from years of unfolding and refolding. The crayon drawing of the heart had faded, but the words were still there. You make me feel safe. And every time he read it, it struck him the same way it had the very first day. A warmth spread through him, a reminder that his long hours and weary bones were not in vain. He had mattered. He had been seen. There were days when the world felt less kind, when neighbors moved away, when old friends passed on, when his body ached in ways he never imagined in his younger years. On those days, he would sit at the edge of his bed, wallet in hand, and carefully slide the paper free. He'd hold it between his fingertips, fragile but unbroken, and it steadied him. It reminded him that even the smallest acts leave footprints, that a smile, a safe ride, a word of kindness could ripple outward long after the moment itself had passed. And so, time went on. Children who once clutched lunchboxes and dolls grew tall. They walked the stage at graduations. They moved away to new cities. Some became parents themselves. But the driver, now older, always carried that folded piece of paper, a living reminder that the years had meaning, that his life's work was never invisible. He had become a man defined not by titles or wealth, but by the quiet impact of one simple note, a note that traveled with him through every season, through every change, through every step of his journey. The seasons turned, the bus eventually grew old, and so did he. Yet still, the note remained, pressed close to his heart, proof that the smallest gestures, when given with love, have the power to last a lifetime. The years have been kind to his heart, but not always to his body. Time, as it always does, left its quiet marks. His steps grew slower. His hair turned a soft, silvery white, and his one steady hands now trembled when he buttoned his shirt in mourning. Still, he carried himself with the same gentle dignity, the same warmth that had made him beloved by so many children through the years. But as he entered the final chapter of his life, the world around him began to feel quieter. The bus no longer waited for him at dawn. The morning stretched longer, filled with the hum of the kettle and the ticking of the clock on his kitchen wall. His days were no longer spent behind the wheel, but rather in a worn armchair by the window, watching the seasons turn outside. Yet one thing never changed. Inside the same old wallet he had carried for decades, tucked carefully into the same slot, was the note. Faded now, almost fragile enough to crumble, but still whole. The creases were deep, the color of the crayon heart nearly gone. But the words, those words still whispered to him. You make me feel safe. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and painted the room in gold, he would sit quietly, pulling the note from its resting place. He unfolded it with care, his fingers brushing against the softened paper. And as he read it once more, his eyes would glisten. It was as though the little girl's voice still reached him, crossing time, cutting through silence, reminding him of the life he had lived. The end of his journey approached gently, like dusk settling over a long day. He had no great riches, no plaques on the wall, no headlines written about his life. But he had something better, something truer. He had love. He had kindness. He had a legacy carried not in grand monuments, but in the hearts of those he had touched. When the time finally came, he left his world with the same quiet grace with which he had lived. And there, in his wallet, folded neatly and placed against his heart, was a note. The very same note a little girl had once scribbled in crayon so many years ago. It was found later, when his belongings were gathered. Some looked at it and saw only an old piece of paper, worn, faded, ordinary. But those who knew him, they understood. They understood that this note was more than paper. It was a story, a memory, a symbol of a life well lived. The bus driver's journey had come to an end, but the message he carried, the simple truth that kindness matters, that love endures, remained etched not just in a fragile note, but in the hearts of everyone who had ever crossed his path. His final chapter was not marked by sorrow, but by quiet beauty. For in the end, he did not pass away holding nothing. He left this world holding proof that he had made a difference, and that perhaps is the greatest gift any of us can hope for. Years later, long after the bus driver had passed, his story did not end. When his belongings were carefully sorted through, family and neighbors discovered that old, weathered wallet. Inside, tucked away with the same care he had given it for decades, was a folded piece of paper. The note, fragile now, its edges frayed, its creases worn so deep that the lines threatened to split, The once bright colors had faded into pale shades, but the words, those words, remained. And with the discovery of that note came a question. Who had written it? Who was a little girl who had once, with simple crayons, given him a gift he carried for a lifetime? It did not take long for the answer to find its way back, through whispers in community, through memories shared among those who had once ridden his bus. The name of the girl emerged. She was no longer little. She was grown now, with children of her own. Her life had moved on, as lives do, filled with responsibilities, new joys, and new struggles. But when she received the news, when she learned that her bus driver had kept her note, until the very end, she stopped in her tracks. For a long moment, she just sat in silence, the world around her blurring. She remembered him, the way he had greeted her each morning. The way his presence had made the bus feel like more than just a ride to school. It had felt like safety, like belonging. She remembered the day she had written the note, her small hands pressing crayon to paper, never imagining it would mean so much. And now here it was, proof that her words, her little gesture, had mattered more than she could have ever dreamed. She was invited to attend a small gathering in his memory, not a grand affair, but a simple service, attended by family, neighbors, and a handful of former students whose lives had been touched by him. When she arrived, she felt her breath catch. On a small table at the front of the room, surrounded by flowers and photographs of his years driving the bus, was her note, placed inside a frame, protected now, as though it were a treasure. And it was... Tears welled in her eyes as she stepped closer. She reached out, her fingertips hovering just above the glass, as though she could still feel the texture of the paper beneath her skin. Around her, people whispered about the man he had been, the kindness he had shown, the lives he had changed, one small moment at a time. For the first time, she realized that she had been part of his story just as much as he had been part of hers. In that quiet room, surrounded by memories and the presence of others who had loved him, she felt something shift inside her. A reunion had taken place. Not of two people in life, but of two souls connected across time. She had given him words that carried him through his journey. And in return, he had given her the knowledge that her kindness had mattered more than she ever knew. It was not the kind of reunion marked by embraces or shared laughter, but it was no less powerful. In her heart, she felt him there, grateful, smiling, carrying the same warmth he had always carried. The little girl and the bus driver had met once again, not in this world, but in the quiet space where love, memory, and legacy live on. In the end, it was never just about a bus ride. It was never just about schedules, stops, or the rumble of an old engine carrying children from one place to another. It was about something deeper, something that could not be measured in miles or years. A little girl once gave her bus driver a note, a piece of paper marked with crayon, clumsy handwriting, and the kind of sincerity only a child can capture. To her, it was simple, just a way of saying thank you. But to him, it became everything. A reminder, folded and carried to the decades, that his life had made a difference. How often do we go through life, never knowing the impact we leave behind? How often do we underestimate the weight of our smallest gestures? A smile, a kind word, a note scribbled in crayon. For him, it was enough to carry in his wallet until the day he died. Enough to remind him on the hardest days that what he did mattered, that who he was mattered. And for her, years later, discovering that truth became its own gift. To realize that the thank you she had once written in innocence had been treasured for a lifetime, it changed the way she saw the world. Because in that moment, she understood we never truly know how far our kindness travels. It is easy to believe that only grand actions shape lives, that only big, bold gestures leave legacies worth remembering. But sometimes it is the smallest act, offered quietly, that becomes the thing someone holds on to when everything else begins to fade. The little girl, now grown, carried that lesson with her. And perhaps, in hearing this story, others will too. Because the truth is simple. Every single one of us is capable of leaving behind a note in someone else's life. Not always on paper, not always written in ink, but through moments, words, and choices that linger long after we're gone. The bus driver carried her note until the very end. And in doing so, he left us with one final reminder: that kindness is never wasted, that gratitude is never too small, and that sometimes the smallest voices echo the loudest across time. And so, the story closes not with an ending, but with an invitation. An invitation to pause, to notice, to thank, to love, while we still can. Because one day, perhaps, something we do, something we say, will be the note someone carries for the rest of their life. And so, his story comes to an end, not with grand achievements or riches, but with a folded note carried close to his heart. A reminder that even the smallest gestures can echo across a lifetime. If this story touched you, imagine how many more are out there waiting to be told. Stories of kindness, of heartbreak, of love that lingers in the quiet corners of life. This is what we share here on Heartfelt Tales TV. If you felt something tonight, hope, warmth, maybe even a tear, don't let the story end here. Subscribe so you'll never miss the next tale waiting for you. And share this one with someone who might need a gentle reminder that the little things matter most. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And until the next story, take care of your heart.